I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.
So it's almost hard to believe when you read in a report called Protecting Against Predators that children in state care in Ireland in the 21st century are being routinely targeted for sexual exploitation. I mean, it really is, we overuse the term in the Sunday world, no doubt shocking, but it really is shocking.
Yeah, it's one of these reports that came out, and I know there was publicity, but there wasn't a huge amount of, say, political discussion or anything, around it. And I think part of that problem is that all these stories that involve TUSLA and kids in care are essentially family law, and you can't name anybody. I mean, there's so many occasions where we've had, just horrific stories where they're watered down to where, to the point where you're saying something happened in a certain part of Ireland and they're going to appear in court again. And that's almost all we can say. And we have to do so little about it. So it doesn't really, we never get to explore what's behind this.
No, and that's definitely the case. I mean, but the facts of it, are genuinely, horrific. There's no other way. Just to give some of the details that was described, it was said that children often in emergency accommodation, which would be hotels, B&Bs, stuff like that, they're being routinely targeted for exploitation and abuse by gangs of predatory men. That in itself is shocking. And it says they're being coerced to provide sexual acts, often in exchange with multiple men, often in exchange for goods. So really, this is the kind of purest form of exploitation that can happen in any society. But the fact is, these children, and they're coming from a variety of different backgrounds, these are actually in the care of the state.
Yeah.
They should be afforded the protection of the state, and this is happening.
Yeah, the fact that they're already in care means that they're already vulnerable. And the idea then that they're being re-exploited or exploited again is quite worrying. Now, sometimes it's possibly down to the young people's own behavioural issues. Now, this was part of, the whole report was done by the Sexual Exploitation Research Project in UCD. Now, and what we're reading now is actually from 3 years ago. And they spoke to different workers in various children's charities, also for people working for private firms who, carry out contract work for TUSLA, looking after people in care. And a lot of these kids wouldn't necessarily be in secure care, but they wouldn't be, say, suitable for a foster family because of their own issues with drug use or self-harming or sexualized behavior themselves. But when some of the anecdotes, from some of the workers that they interviewed are, they leave you cold. There's one instance, there's one of a 13-year-old girl who phones the home to say, she was persuaded to go there by her cousin, and effectively she was raped in that apartment by people, not necessarily raped by people known to her, but she was certainly lured to that apartment by people that were known to her. And there was another worker talked about a case of a young man or a young boy with learning difficulties, who again was clearly being sexually exploited, was disappearing for late at night, coming back in the mornings, would have unexplained sums of money, would have video games. And, when it was raised that, look, this is clearly signs of sexual exploitation, it was a case of it would be too disruptive to his psychiatric care or his help at this stage to move him to another place. And yet the same people are speaking anecdotally about kids who are getting on reasonably well, and they're in school and come back to their care home to find all their belongings in black plastic bags because they've been moved on somewhere else without any warning.
Yeah,
so there's such a sense of dysfunction.
Yeah, it absolutely is. They have talk about literally grown men hanging around hotel lobbies where a lot of these kids are staying, waiting to pick them up. And, it's not like a child at risk or in a vulnerable circumstance can end up in a terrible or abusive circumstance, but this is something systematic and organised and going on and allowed go on in this state. If you think, and I can't claim total innocence in that we did a podcast on RTE. But if you look at, say, the scandal of RTE relative to something of this magnitude, if you look at the column inches devoted to Ryan Tubridy compared with this, like there is something amiss, isn't there? Like about
yeah, definitely. I mean, it's like I've spoken with Nicola about this before, about the way the prison service was always treated as something to try and forget about, and the best way to get promoted was to make sure the minister never has to hear about anything going on in the prison service. And you get a sense sometimes that that's the sort of attitude that at a certain level, within organisations like TUSLA, is that somebody flagging problems is a problem rather than the problems they're flagging being what's at issue. I mean, like one of the people interviewed in this report, they were talking about even the uneven approach that guards would have. They, in some areas where there might be a long-standing care facility, they'd have a good relationship with a particular guard inspector, and if a kid went missing, they were able to act quickly and they understood what was going on and they bring him back. Then in other places, guards are saying, well, why can't you just lock the door? And they were saying, so, well, they're kids like in any other home. You don't lock them in. You're holding them against their will. And they were having trouble getting their heads around it, and then just stopped going looking for these kids when they were being reported missing. Now, without trying not to ruin a good story here, like you are talking, I think, around about 400 children that are in this kind of emergency care and or secure care, as far as I know. So, I mean, you're not talking thousands and thousands. And then within that, you're talking a smaller amount again who are being possibly targeted or they're being groomed to some extent. They don't necessarily feel they're being targeted when they're acting in a sexual way at that age. I mean, like nobody's going to be consenting to anything at the age of 13, 14, 15. But they do talk about TUSA do take care of trying to keep the identity, not the identities, but the locations of their care units quiet, for the simple reason that they don't want people turning up necessarily, for instance, even, abusive family members or, people targeting. But there was one where they talked about a city, not in Dublin, that there was one close to the city centre, and kind of word had got around among, certain individuals that these girls are there for the picking and would regularly try and bump into them, when they were going out to buy chips or do what teenage girls do, that these fellas would, and often, men in their 20s and 30s. And sometimes, the girls saw this as a bit of status, that you should have a boyfriend with a car.
Yeah, but I mean, this is always, I suppose, and if you go to countries like, I've been in Vietnam and Laos and places like that, you'll see this, that, it can be a status symbol, but it's wrong. And, the fact is that those countries exist in deep poverty, and that's why these things occur, these exploitative relationships. We're not a poor country by any definition, and it's still going on. I mean, Tanya Ward, the CEO of the Children's Rights Alliance, was on RTE speaking about how 15 unaccompanied minors have gone missing from TUSLA's care. I mean, they're gone missing. Nobody knows where they are. That's in the last year. I mean, that is, I'm not saying that, it can be easy to find these, and there's no doubt complicated situations around it, but it should be, a sort of a national scandal. Now, like TUSLA, I mean, my own dealings with them as a journalist, I have to say I've struggled with them ever to get answers out of them. I know of cases where TUSLA's own actions could have been called into question and have been called into question, and I'm still having to speak in code here because I know that these cases, TUSLA had a case to answer for the care of a child where sexual crimes were occurred. I mean, they're very, very defensive organisation. Are they being held to account properly, do you believe?
Well, I have a similar experience in that there was a case that went on to be quite high profile, and we'd gotten a tip-off that something, was going on, and was described by people involved as one of the worst cases of child sexual abuse that they'd ever seen. And we wrote a very benign story that,
a benign story would mean there was no names, there was no
names, there was no location. We didn't even suggest what region of the country it was in. We didn't talk about the age of the children. We didn't talk about how many. If there was one or more, we didn't mention the gender of the kids. Nothing was mentioned. And then we ran a follow-up and got a legal letter then to say that an injunction had been taken out after the first article to make sure there was no further coverage of it. But no one had thought to inform us that an injunction had been taken out. So this is, it's quite possibly just one arm of the organisation isn't speaking to the other. But it makes it almost impossible. So when people say, well, why aren't mainstream media or why aren't the Sunday World looking at this, and why aren't they, doing stuff about this story? Every so often when it comes out, like when you had that retired Judge Sims come out recently talking about his fears for being able to with children not being put into proper places, like being left in, emergency accommodations such as hotels. And he was talking about the potential for lawsuits coming down the road for the state. And people say, well, why aren't we covering it? That's one of the reasons that we just can't.
I'll tell you one thing, right? There's no doubt that TUSLA are understaffed, under pressure. They don't have places to house people. So there's no doubt the organisation is I think its own CEO described it as at crisis point. Some of that is there's a lack of resources, no doubt about that. However, every single week I answer the phone in the Sunday World to callers, and every single week you will speak to parents who are in family law disputes with TUSLA. You know yourself, Eamon, you've sat there. There's very little we can do, but they always speak about how aggressively TUSLA pursue them through the courts. And so although the organisation may be understaffed and under-resourced, certainly in their legal avenues, they're not failing there. So, just to describe the law on reporting on these things, basically anything involving a child and a crime, you're not allowed to give any details that will identify the child victim. Often that can mean, because there could be sort of family relationships or whatever, that can mean you can't name the perpetrator either. That's not an issue that somebody can sue over. It's a criminal issue where the newspaper will be held responsible and could be criminally prosecuted. So when you're looking to talk about these cases, what you end up with is really, really vague stories. Now, nobody is saying vulnerable children's identities should be splashed all over the news. However, you see it differently in England, don't you? You see how child protection cases can be covered differently and in a broader manner.
Yeah, I suppose in a way, like it's very difficult for the media to challenge that type of law. I think it would need different legislation, or it'd need an agreement to interpret the current legislation the right way, or whatever. Like, it would take it would take something like Media House to go after the legislation in court and try and battle, but you'd be up against the resources of the state.
Yeah.
And what would you be doing it for? When you talk about it, you might win your case in one particular story, but then find yourself having to do it all over again. So, look, it really does it really hampers any kind of free journalism in terms of being able to write about these cases. And there's just so many, there was a case, it was even before I think I was in the Sunday World, when I was working for another newspaper, and it was a 15-year-old who was found dead of a heroin overdose here on Talbot Street in a B&B at the time. And I had been speaking to another family whose son was in the same facilities, and they had known her. She'd been in and out of their house, and they were trying to raise attention. Like, this is 20 plus years ago. They were trying to raise attention about certain things, like where you only had security guards on duty in some of these secure facilities at night. Like their son, and this stuff has been printed. They spoke to me at the time, and they believe he had been sexually abused by an uncle, and came to the attention of the guards at the age of 9 when he burnt down a church, and has continued into a life of crime, a life of like seriously disruptive behavior. Like I'm pretty sure he's currently in prison at the minute. But the 15-year-old girl, like, she was found dead. She had been fostered to a family in South County Dublin and ended up in a nice school, but couldn't get beyond like her basic issues. And when her foster family couldn't handle things, care orders were made, and she was put into one particular secure facility where this other boy had been. And they were talking about, just there was no social workers, there was no specialists, there was nobody there to help, deeply troubled teenagers to get through what they needed to get through until they got to some point in their life where they could, start to understand themselves. I mean, like dealing with an ordinary teenager, you know, like you do a certain amount of saving them from themselves. Like, you know, if you let your average 12-year-old will do a 36-hour stint on an Xbox, no problem. So if you have somebody, you know, like at 13 or 14 who has a cocaine problem, like, can you imagine trying to go through that as a regular parent? It's actually terrifying.
And that's, I mean, you get to the heart of it there. There's no necessarily simple answers to complex problems. However, one of the better answers is foster care, because, and that was mentioned by retired Judge Sims as well, that, you know, putting kids in sort of residential settings, children's homes where there's big groups of kids in a one facility overseen by, you know, people on rotation, on shift work, like that is obviously less ideal than having kids in with stable families. You know, having children in stable families gives them a better chance. I think everybody could agree on that. However, like, what are we doing for foster families? I think it was, I can't remember when they were on Joe Duffy recently. There was a number of foster families complaining about how, you know, I think it was since the 1990s, there'd be no raise in the price given to foster families who are paid by the state. How loads of them complained about how if they make complaints to TUSLA, they have kids taken off them, put back into the system, that they find TUSLA really, really difficult to deal with, that if they ask for requests, say for holidays and cover, that's not granted to them. You know, that, you know, the system is failing on all levels. And, you know, whatever about getting in more social workers, which everybody agrees is a good idea, like surely some of our resources of this government, you know, which we're still a rich country, should go to support foster families. And there's no doubt about it, foster families are not happy about how they're being treated.
Yeah. And I mean, like when you consider that we are, you know, we are genuinely a wealthy nation. And I think there was even the UN Committee on the Rights of Children were expressing concerns recently about children's rights in Ireland. And they were kind of surprised to find that there was, you know, our ability to uphold the rights of these troubled kids was being hampered by a lack of resources.
Yeah.
But even for, you know, people kind of saying, well, you know, it's too expensive, you know, the amount of care and attention you need. But again, to bring it back to the crime side of it, like, again, more than 2 decades ago, I wrote, I think we called it the Club 400 or the Club 800 story in the Sunday World. And there was 8 or 9 young people at that time who between them had 800 convictions in and around Dublin City and Dublin South City. 2 of whom were the Dumbrells at the time. Yeah. Another of whom was McNally of the Zambra gang in Crumlin. Oh, sorry, I just can't remember off the top of my head some of the others, but they all went on to be like seriously dangerous criminals. Like, so how much money, you know, would have been saved to the state if there had been the intervention that was possibly needed when they were 5, 6 or 7, rather than waiting till they end up, you know, with serious, you know, drug issues, you know, literally running amok. And I mean, you know, when you look at what happened in Dublin city centre over the last week, and even last night, there's videos of more fights emerging, and, you know, people are going to be kind of talking about it before, because, you know, we work in the area and you almost get used to it. Like, if you see a scuffle on the street, you kind of ignore it, or you see a pool of blood sometimes, you actually don't think twice about it. Oh, I mean, you just become inured to it, which is wrong. Because, like, if you're in some nice parts of town, you'd be saying, "Oh my God, there was a scuffle outside Kildare House, or outside, I don't know, somewhere very nice, like on the south side." So, like, why should people who live here and work here have to tolerate that? I mean, it's certainly not fair to the kids who are growing up in the area.
Well, I'd ask this, right? You know, as you said, like we work in Talbot Street, go out there every day, you can see things happening. Last week, obviously, there was a deeply tragic incident that a 57-year-old American sustained really serious injuries and remains in hospital. For whatever reason, that has caught the eye of the public. And we've had Helen McEntee down on Talbot Street. We've had Micheál Martin talking about Talbot Street. We've had various other people all over the media talking about it. It's no different than what you see all the time. I mean, it's for whatever reason, because it's somehow maybe the circumstances of that man, that he was over looking for his Irish family, it caught the public attention. As a result, some change will occur. Some focus on the problems of the Talbot Street area will occur, and that's a good thing. Unfortunately, this report that we're speaking about, young women in particular, young girls being routinely targeted and exploited by men, it's not going to catch the same amount of attention. And that's a really, really sad thing. And that's not to say that American tourist, that's in some way less tragic or undeserving of attention. Of course it's deserving of attention. It's just, and some of that is due to the problems of how these things are reported, and also the accountability. I mean, that happened. That's a violent act on a 57-year-old man. We have people standing up in the Dáil being questioned about it. We have Helen McEntee being doorstepped. We have the victim's family speaking. In some way, this isn't happening in this other case involving the girls.
Even if you remember, just a couple of years ago, there was the Here, Leave It Out video that went viral, and it was a funny haha video. But it was somebody like getting their head kicked in on Talbot Street. Like, it was a seriously violent video. But the joke was about, the lady with the strong North Dublin accent, shouting at one of the men to stop kicking the fella on the ground. Yeah. But I suppose what's different with the American tourists being badly injured and attacked like that is that, being typically Irish, we're very, I suppose we're easily embarrassed when something happens to foreigners. And if you look at the GoFundMe page, it's full of Irish people apologising to the Americans, apologising to Stephen Termini's family, and and to the people who apologising to the people who set up the page, offering their €20, their 30, 40, 50 euro. And it was an incredible amount of money. They set the target at 10,000, and it was close to the 100,000 the last time I looked. Yeah. And I think one of the other things that will, I think, possibly, cause Ireland to look, the Irish government or the people even, to look more closely at the issue that we're talking about today, is the fact that you have, say, a UN committee pointing out the fact we're not upholding children's rights. And the fact that, there isn't enough psychiatric care, there isn't, the CAMS service, which is, they're terribly boring stories in one way to try and talk about in a newspaper, but they're incredibly, they do incredibly serious work and have helped so many people, at a small level. But that's how you do it. It's like ants, you have to do it bit by bit. And even there's another area, again, which we've spoken on before, about the area of people trafficking and sex trafficking. And Ireland still has an embarrassing tier 2 status. We don't have a tier 1 status because we don't do enough about it. Where you still have 700, women and men being advertised in sex for sale services, sex for sale websites in Ireland. And yet there's been a handful of cases, and they fully thought that, a case last year in Mullingar was going to be enough to get us back up to tier 1 status. And this is something that the Americans, come up with in terms of, gauging a country's willingness to take on human trafficking. So we've got now two foreign bodies saying, we're not doing enough in these areas that people normally, traditionally, we've kind of tried to forget about and leave it alone, like it's going to go away. Nobody wants to be involved in that kind of work. It's a bit too tricky. It's too hard. Yeah. Whereas we need to make it not hard for people who want to help these troubled kids. In other words, one person isn't left with a stupid caseload. That there's whole teams of people looking after it, and they're able to discuss it and share the burden.
Yeah, and I mean, there has to be a public accountability by the people, TUSLA primarily, in my opinion, that are in charge of this. It may be that they don't have the resources to deal with it, but there has to be a bit more accountability. Just to quote Dr. Mary Canning, who wrote that report about the girls being exploited, she says, as a society, we tend to shy away from things and a discomfort with naming rape as rape and naming sexual assault as sexual assault. We have so much evidence of the silence that has occurred in Ireland in the past, in particular with children. People just want to look away because they are so uncomfortable in thinking this can happen to children in our country. And of course, we do look back on things like the mother and baby homes with great shame and great, a great sense that this is something in the past. It's not as in the past as we would like to think, in my opinion. How children are being treated in care is, it's gravely wrong in many occasions. It's admitted by the state to be gravely wrong. Even TUSLA will admit some of it is gravely wrong. But, you know, I don't know if it's being treated as an emergency, you know?
No, it's not. And it's going to come to bite us on the butt in the future because, like, you know, certainly many of these kids are very vulnerable and some of them are being exploited. Some of them are being groomed by, you know, drug gangs. Some of them, you know, never get to see a foster home because they end up in you know, basically in prison from an early age. So, I mean, you know, we're just storing up problems for the future. There was like, this is going back again a little while, but there was a former college pal of mine and starting their first job in a major city in this country as a social worker, kind of, you know, was told she got the job and you could head off now to, this is the office, you know, where you're going to be. So, you know, you're going to start in whatever, 2 or 3 weeks time. So turns up at the address and knocks on the door and you guys are up on the 3rd floor, walks up to the 3rd floor or whatever it was and kind of finds, you know, a whole bunch of empty offices with files and so on desks. And this is why it was related to me, and eventually find somebody and said, hi, I'm one of the new social work team. He says, where should I start? And the answer from somebody was, pick a file.
Yeah.
And that was it. Yeah. Hello and welcome to your first day.
Exactly. And
I mean, who's going to want to do that kind of work?
Exactly. And I mean, it's, you know, the social workers, there's many brilliant social workers who take great risks and, you know, are so committed. But, you know, it has to be said as an organization, it's not working. I mean, I remember somebody contacting me to do a story. They had a younger sibling in care. That sibling had suffered abuse in care. And I remember sending in a few press inquiries to TUSLA, and I remember getting back legal threats rather than answers, you know. And I mean, this is a problem. That's a journalist's problem. It's not the core of the problem. The core of the problem is that you have to have an accountable system there when these things are going wrong. But look, you know, I think it's shocking. Really, I do think it's shocking.
No, I think one of the reasons why I suppose, you know, people don't dwell on it is because it's so shocking.
Yeah.
And if you start thinking about it in terms of your own kids or your grandkids, like you wouldn't be able to sleep at night.
No.
And yet we're letting this pass by. When we get a chance to write about it, we just can't.
Yeah. Anyway, I mean, it's good to speak about this, and it's maybe something we will come back to, and, you know, maybe see if we can find another way to investigate and look at this again in the future. It's
a grim stuff, so hopefully we haven't disappointed too many people who normally the chirpier version of Crime World.
Who want to see Nicola bully me.
Fully deserved now.
Yeah. Thanks, Eamon.
You're welcome.